one of the real questions is, to what extent should you believe that the thoughts that you generate are yours, that they're rational and based on conscious decision making as opposed to unconscious subliminal generation, et cetera. And so when I mentioned to you about the problems of language come down to problems of philosophy, the questions that really arise, whether you're talking about social media, how to improve our society nowadays, how to reconsider what a human being is that is both consistent with what we understand about biology, but isn't so nihilistic as to prevent any hope whatsoever. And so that's a preamble to your various questions, because they all get down to the same kind of questions. What is the nature of agency? What is the nature of yourself? To what extent should you be given credit for what you do versus how much should you take blame for what you did wrong? And each one of these are subjects unto themselves, which collectively all boil down to the nature of what's a human being in this new era of evolving neuroscience and the increasing recognition of the decreasing value of so-called concepts like man as a rational human being. And so now with that as a preamble, now you can ask me some questions.
What kind of response do you expect from the readers? Is it simply humility, or knowing who you are, or just living big, open-ended question to people?
Okay, let me try and make it as simple as I can, even though I'm very convoluted. I think what it amounts to is, as long as we consider ourselves master of our thoughts, that we generate them consciously, we decide whether they're right or wrong consciously, then it's only natural that we will believe that every opinion that we come to is not only our opinion but that it's correct, and therefore it's better than other opinions. Now, postmodernism, which would take the opposite tack, that all opinions are equal, is not the answer either. There has to be some way where you can decide whether it's one opinion better than another, at the same time recognizing that on the individual level, the opinions are generated by subconscious forces. And you mentioned earlier Steven Pinker. Really good example. Steven Pinker is an optimist by nature. And I wrote a book review of him and Daniel Kahneman. And the two of them had a conference or a conversation in which Pinker was a wild optimist and Kahneman is a complete pessimist. Now, we can argue that Kahneman was a product of World War II and persecution, and Pinker grew up in Canada and didn't have that. So maybe there are psychological forces, maybe. But on the other hand, if you go back to my original premise that a lot of our traits are in significant degree generated out of biology and early development. So I thought to myself, why did Steven Pinker write a book in which he said people are becoming less violent? Now, I mention this as a model for thinking about questions in general, because every time a person says something, the first thing I do is to say, why would you take that line of reasoning? Now, he obviously is an optimist. He believes somehow, for whatever reason, that rationality is the key to success as a human, as our species. I'd like to think that's true, but there's no evidence in my mind that supports that. And I'm of the contrary opinion that maybe if we accepted the fact that we weren't rational and that we're all thrown in this together, we would have more humility and more regard for each other. But I also recognize that comes from my point of view, which is also irrational and subliminal. So my subliminal disapproval, if that's not quite the right word, but questioning of Pinker's motivation is based on my subliminal view. Now, that sounds very convoluted, but if you see that in a much larger context, and that difference is present all the time when we meet somebody, then maybe that's the way we should adopt our point of view in the first place. You say, why did he say that? And whatever he says, is that consistent with what we understand about science, or is his self-knowledge limited, which it is? But on the other hand, whom asking this question also limited by my own self-knowledge, and that's where humility comes in. If I had to give a sermon, I would say that we have grossly overstated, each of us, who we are in relationship to the world. In other words, we have a strong sense of self. In other words, for example, last week I had a foot problem. hurt my foot. And I'm watching a TV documentary on people in Nigeria are starving to death. And I'm trying to think about the relationship between my sore foot and the millions of people aren't getting food. you understand exactly what I mean. I'm going,
Yes,
you've
yes.
got to be an idiot to be worried about your foot, or you've got to be so egomaniacal that your foot is more important. And yet it feels that way because it's my foot and they're in Africa. And it's the problem of empathy. But the point I was getting at is that for each of us, we have very varying degrees of how strongly we feel about ourselves at every instant. If somehow we could diffuse the idea that our sense of self correlates specifically with a real entity, but rather is a species generated feeling that's stronger or less stronger according to background in biology, but
And
that is
chemistry.
yeah, but that is not real in the sense that you open up my body at autopsy and there's a self there. There's nothing there physically. It is a construct your brain has generated. In order for you to get on in the world, you have to have a sense of the confines of your body in order to march along and do something. But it doesn't mean that that is something special, and it doesn't mean that it's something that you have conscious control over to any significant degree. Although if you recognize you're going in the wrong direction, maybe you're having bad marriage or this or that, you can recognize maybe I can change this, but how do I change that? Well, I have to change that by readjusting my circuitry in my brain in such a way. And so you read books, you do things that maybe put more information into your subconscious that generates a different person. And I wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times several years ago on Donald Trump. And I wrote him as being the first beta version of an artificial intelligence person. What if you thought of Donald Trump as just being an artificial intelligence machine in which the sole goal was winning? I mean, that was all there was. There wasn't any ideology. There isn't any motivation beyond, well, if that were the case, an artificial machine, our intelligence machine would just get feedback every time you got a vote. It'd be a positive. Every time you didn't get a vote, it would be a negative. And you would become a machine geared, period. Now, is there an underlying motivation for the person? Probably, but that's not important. The point thing is that that's how it's generated. Now, this is true for him. It's also true for all of us. And you say, well, what are the motivations? What are the goals you have? And to the extent that we don't know what our goals are, because most people aren't very introspective, then they may well adopt goals that they don't really believe in. And a good example would be you see people work really hard, friends who've made a fortune, and then one day they go, I don't know why I did, because they never really thought about why they were working towards money. Then they feel lost. And so you see a midlife crisis come on where they never considered for a moment how they were put together. You say, well, I guess I chose making money. But then you say, well, money's less important for me than purpose and meaning and giving and decency in the world. You follow me, and empathy. If those are better goals, then maybe you can change. So maybe you can change your stripes over time through insinuating yourself into your own biology. Now, I don't know if that works or doesn't work, but to the extent it does work, it requires constant introspection, even knowing that it's wrong. Now, that may sound too convoluted.
How do you know about yourself? Think of a person who had a father of low self-esteem.
Right?
And then if you are born in that family, you might find it hard to finding who you are.
I'll tell you something personal, which maybe be helpful. Is my sister and I have completely different views of our childhood, the relationship of my parents to us. Okay. And part of it is my father was born in 1902. I mean, think about that. That's a long time ago. And they didn't have feminism. People didn't think about equality the same way they do now. And he was hardworking, worked really hard to send us both to college and whatever, help us, but he had old-fashioned values. Now, it created a lot of friction and difficult times, whatever. On the other hand, he tried his best. And I'm sure that he loved us in his way the best he could. Now, time goes along and you have to decide how to live your life. I have decided how to live my life, and my sister has to decide how to live her life. And she came up with a negative view of my father and refused to talk to him. I, on the other hand, told myself a narrative that he did his best considering the times and how he was brought up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I told a story that said, I love him. He loved me. That's good enough. Forget the other stuff. And that's made me come to peace with the whole thing. Now, that's not psychology in a way, because we didn't scrape why he did what he did, why his parents did what they did. It's not about explanation. It's about acknowledging that we'll never know all those explanations. And now we have to decide how to get on with your life. So maybe she's equally correct. If you know you've created a narrative or a belief, you can simultaneously say, I know this is a narrative, maybe a false narrative, but it works for me. Therefore, I'm going to say, I'm living with a false narrative, but I like that. Someone else could look at the same thing and have a different narrative. I have to respect that theirs might equally be correct. You follow me? Even if it's a false narrative, if it does people good and doesn't do harm, it's acceptable, because everybody needs purpose. And if you want a world in which there's less friction, it's got to be a world in which there's more. Everybody has a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning. And if it comes from an illusion or a delusion or false narrative, so be it, as long as it's not harmful. So when you mention about how to learn about yourself, you learn how to construct stories that make your life meaningful at the same time as not being ridiculous. So I find that literature and biographies of famous people and stuff, and recognize that you're treading on the dual thing that you have to have something to believe in, even when you know it's not true. That's very, very difficult.
Any last words to people of Korea?
Don't take life too seriously.
All right. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for the time. And
Thank you very much.
you have a good one,
Thank
sir.
you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.